Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round Podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications, and your podcast co-host. This week we present highlights from our 2025 Sir Antony Fisher Dinner, which was held at the Peninsula Golf and Country Club in San Mateo in September. At this year's dinner, we presented three very interesting speakers providing their diverse perspectives on the political challenges that we're facing these days. First, we have the noted author and historian and commentator Victor Davis Hanson, who presents his thought on the tragic assassination of Turning Point's Charlie Kirk. Charlie had been assassinated only a few days before our gala dinner. And Victor talks about, how should we as free marketeers and conservatives view this great tragedy for the movement, and what should we do to carry on in Charlie's legacy going on. Following Victor Davis Hanson's remarks, we hear from Professor Charles Kesler from Claremont McKenna College. He's also the editor of the Claremont Review of Books and the husband of our president and CEO, Sally Pipes. And Professor Kesler presents his response to Victor Davis Hanson's presentation. He shares his own thoughts and insights on the assassination of Charlie Kirk, who was one of his students briefly. And we'll hear from Professor Richard Epstein, 2025 recipient of PRI's Taube Family Freedom Prize, who will share his thoughts on all the controversies over free speech on campus and the Trump administration's battles with university administrators. I think you'll find it a very interesting hour. For those of you who have never been to a PRI dinner before, it'll give you an insider's look at what you can expect attending one of the many dinners and events that we hold around the state. So stay tuned. After the message, please enjoy the keynote comments from Victor Davis Hanson. Thanks for listening. We'll get back to our terrific interview in just a moment, but first, PRI's YouTube channel is must-watch. By visiting youtube.com/PacificResearch1, that's the number 1, you can watch webinars, videos, and other original content, including our new Free City Center video tours and interviews. You can watch as PRI's Wayne Weingarten tours Dignity Moves, a San Francisco nonprofit that is reimagining scalable solutions to homelessness with founder and CEO Elizabeth Funk. And you can check out Stephen Greenhut's tour of a proposed new city in rural Solano County that has generated significant interest and intrigue. You can even listen to previous episodes of Next Round Podcast. So visit PRI's YouTube channel today at youtube.com/PacificResearch1, that's the number 1, and click the subscribe button to receive notifications about our latest content as soon as it's posted.
Hello, this is Victor Davis Hanson. First of all, I want to apologize to everybody. I was scheduled to speak to you this evening, and I had been planning to do so for months. But I had a health issue come up, and I'm in the process of getting it diagnosed and treated, so I won't be able to come. So I'm trying to address you through remote Zoom. I want to talk about very briefly the tragic passing of Charlie Kirk. Especially, I think we should look at three issues or three questions that have been plaguing so many people. Who was Charlie Kirk? Why was he killed? And what are we to react or do about it? Charlie Kirk was probably the most gifted young political activist and organizer in either party or either ideology, conservative or liberal, in the United States. He brought a lot of talents. He was an organizer to his effective campaign to tour campuses and to address the next generation of voters. He was an organizer, of course. He created Turning Point USA from scratch and made it into a $100 million a year organization, a vast organization. He was a podcaster. He wrote columns. He had only had 1 year of college, and yet he would wade right into college, Oxford or Cambridge, and out-debate people with impressive academic degrees. So he had a multifaceted political career and media career, and he brought to that career certain innate and acquired talents. He was a wonderful impromptu speaker. He was a good writer. He could inspire people, and he was an administrator. He oversaw a vast organization that he had created himself. All that said, then I think the second question, why was he killed, was pretty obvious. For years now, people all through the ranks of the left have been calling Donald Trump a fascist. We've had Kamala Harris say it, high-ranking generals and admirals, bureaucrats, governors. It's really lowered the bar of what is accepted. If you believe that Donald Trump is Hitler, like the New Republic did when it put him on their cover, or you believe he's a fascist, that message permeates throughout society. And people like Tyler Robinson, the killer of Charlie Kirk, then react to that. And they feel like, Luigi Mangione, that if you were to kill somebody that has an ideological agenda opposed to yours, then you're going to be iconic. You will be rewarded. And then there's the other incentive that in our society, therapeutic society, it's not clear that justice will be swift or final. So a lot of people feel that they'll either get off of the crime, or they won't serve time, or they'll be sentenced alternatively to some non-incarceration treatment center or something. And so that lowers the bar of what's acceptable, and it lowers the bar of expecting any punishment. But Charlie Kirk was a little different. He wasn't just a political organizer, and that is, he didn't go around in 2024 to the swing states and say, vote to close the border, or vote to reduce crime, or vote to allow fracking, the traditional Republican agenda. He was looking at deeper causes. He was saying to the nation, there is a reason why we have an open border. There is a reason why these nihilist policies of letting 12 million people in the country exist. There is a reason why we left Afghanistan the way we did. And the reason is that a young generation is getting the wrong message. They are being indoctrinated by higher education on matters of transgenderism, on matters of foreign policy, on matters of energy use, on matters of crime. And I'm going to address those root causes. And so if you look at what he was saying, I had talked to him 2 weeks earlier, and he was very fired up in our conversation on Zoom about his worry that young Americans, especially men, were marrying too late. We had a 1.6 fertility rate in the United States. We were not reproducing ourselves, and therefore ossifying and shrinking our population. And we weren't buying homes, we being the new generation. And he wanted to address those root causes. And he said, if we don't do it, we're going to get a socialist demagogue like Mondani. And we have to prevent that. And the way to prevent that was to go to the universities themselves and appeal directly in a dialogue with people who didn't share his view. That had been enormously successful. If you look at Donald Trump's 2020 vote total, in the popular vote, and you look at 2024, he increased that vote by 6%, and much higher among young men. That youth vote is usually defined as 19 years of age to 40. But here's the key. Although Kamala Harris probably won the youth vote in general by a small margin, that 6% nationwide that Trump picked up was very critical in swing states. But it proved absolutely determinative in the three that counted: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. In Michigan, he split the youth vote, 49 to 49. And that was a 23% increase from his vote tally in 2020. Same to a lesser degree, but still substantial, was true of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And I think that result is mostly attributable to Charlie Kirk and his Turning Point USA's massive campaign to blanket the swing states, go to campuses, urge people to register, and then on election day or prior to election day through early voting or mail-in voting, get the vote out. The left knew that. In other words, you could say that Mr. Robinson and the circle in which he inhabited felt that Charlie Kirk had entered their critical space, that he was appealing to their friends, he was questioning their values, and he was, most importantly, and tragically for him, he was very successful at it. And they felt that he was making inroads in a way that no conservative Republican had ever done, and he had been responsible probably for the election of Donald Trump and perhaps the election of Donald Trump's successors. The third question, if we know what Charlie Kirk did and what he represented and why he might have been killed, what are we supposed to do about it? The first thing we have to do is to address the untruth. People are saying this is the conservatives' effort to find a George Floyd movement. I don't think George Floyd should have died in police custody. I don't have enough information to know exactly the circumstances, but to use George Floyd to define Charlie Kirk is absurd. George Floyd had an 8-count criminal record. He was a former prison convict. He had a violent home intrusion conviction where he put a knife at the abdomen of a young woman. At the time that he was arrested, he was trying to pass counterfeit currency. He was on fentanyl and methamphetamines. He had a heart condition. He was suffering from long COVID again and again and again. There was no comparison. Charlie Kirk was a devout Christian. He was happily married. He had no crime record. He had 2 wonderful children, beautiful wife. He was beloved by everybody, and he was trying in a nonviolent way to interact with people on the left and persuade them that they had been misled. And specifically, he said a number of times, the blue state model, if you look at fertility, is not working. 1.3, 1.4 compared to 1.8 to 2 in the red states. People are leaving blue states. People are unhappy that are in blue states. The taxes are too high. The entitlements are not sustainable. The prices of homes and energy are not sustainable. And he was saying to people, you have to see this dichotomy and wonder why the red, or inquire why the red model is working and the blue is not. So we need to correct that untruth that he was somehow a George Floyd-like, this was somewhat a George Floyd moment. But more importantly, look at the reaction to the death of Charlie Kirk compared to the death of George Floyd. Given the circumstances that I outlined with George Floyd, what entailed were 5 months of serial rioting, looting, arson, $2 billion in damages, 35 people dead, 1,500 police officers injured, arson, looting, as I said, and more importantly, a police precinct torched, an iconic church torched, a federal courthouse torched, large areas of downtown occupied. People in that protest cycle tried to go into the White House grounds and reach Donald Trump. He had to be evacuated to a bunker. Contrast that with the reaction after the death of Charlie Kirk. What were people saying? What were they doing? They were holding candlelight vigils. They were subscribing in greater numbers to his organization, Turning Point USA. They were promising to make a big difference in their own lives. It was entirely peaceful. In fact, the only disruptive reactions to his death were sort of a ghoulish reaction on social media or in Hollywood or among higher education administrators, professors, and teachers, people in the military who gloated over his death in a way that wasn't really true even about George Floyd on people on the right. So there was no connection whatsoever with either the lives of George Floyd nor Charlie Kirk, nor did conservatives or traditionalists try to use that event of Charlie's assassination in a way the left tried to manipulate the death of George Floyd to enact or push through an agenda that had no popular support, but was able to be passed and reified because of the general chaotic conditions that followed his death. Finally, what should we all do? I think a lot of people said, well, we have to remain calm. That's true. We should try to emulate his example and appeal to college students. That's half of the youth. We should. But I think if you really wanted to commemorate the death of Charlie Kirk, you would do this. Historically, an administration after 2 years in office loses badly, if I could use that word, does poorly in the midterm elections. If that were to happen, we would see the Trump counter-revolution, the counter-revolution that Charlie Kirk was an integral part of and helped facilitate. It would falter. It would evaporate. Donald Trump will likely, if he loses the House, be impeached. They will eat up a year or two of his remaining tenure in office. And his agenda to close the border, insist on legal-only immigration, reduce crime, increase energy, try to deal with our financial mess, restore deterrence abroad, ensure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon, champion the cause of Israel. That will be in shambles. It will not be an effective agenda any longer without congressional support. So I would urge all of you, as I'm going to do, to talk to as many people as you can, contribute, and get everybody out to vote next November in the midterm elections. And vote overwhelmingly for candidates who are Republican, traditionalists, conservatives, and in that way honor what Charlie Kirk was trying to do and make sure that this quite necessary counter-revolution against the current madness will be successful. Thank you very much. This is Victor Davis Hanson. I'm so sorry I can't be with you tonight, but I hope I have been in some small way with this Zoom. Thank you.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week. And now here are remarks from Professor Charles Kesler.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be here tonight, although I'm in a difficult rhetorical position, commenting on the great Victor Davis Hanson, who's not able to join us, and having a conversation with the great Richard Epstein, who is very much here, and in a very good and lively mood, I can tell you from his conversation at the table, which I participated in a little bit, but mostly overheard. So, thank you to my lovely wife, Sally. We have been happily married for 22 years. Is that right? Yeah. Then there's that other 10 years, but that's we don't want to bring that up at this point. All right, so in that video and on that screen, Victor Davis Hanson, I thought, looked composed, learned, and no nonsense, as he always does. He looked so good, in fact, that I wouldn't be surprised if a VDH television show, part news and part commentary, were not coming to our screen soon on Fox, or Newsmax, or maybe even ABC, who knows. I certainly hope his health allows him to rally and to carry his message far and wide. It's been a long time since conservatives had an intellectually dynamic and politically responsible media personality on our side. Since, let's say, Charles Krauthammer, and Rush Limbaugh and Bill Buckley were walking the media pathways. Having mentioned my old friend Bill Buckley, I take this opportunity gladly to remind you that Bill's 100th birthday falls in this year, 2025, and will be celebrated by Pacific Research with an exciting sale and onshore dinner this October in Newport Beach. A combination of sailing, eating, drinking, and talking is just the kind of fun Bill would have loved. And I hope you will honor his memory or help honor his memory by attending this celebration, and as he would say, celebration, on Saturday, October 4th in Newport Beach. Tickets are available. If he migrates to television, Victor Davis Hanson would deserve to be included, I think, in that short pantheon of media giants I just enunciated. The amazing fact, as Victor emphasizes, is that Charlie Kirk had already cracked that glass ceiling himself at a very young age. He began his media ascent really about the age of 18. And he, of course, was taken from us at the young age of 31. I knew him, Charlie Kirk, slightly, having taught him for 2 weeks or so in a small summer seminar run by the Claremont Institute a few years ago. It was, I think, during the COVID years, and so the seminar, in order to be socially distanced but not too rigorously, had to be held in Las Vegas. But as always, the things that happen in Las Vegas don't stay in Las Vegas. So I can tell you, I can share this impression from that 2 weeks or so I spent with Charlie Kirk, that he did not have much of a formal education. He had about a semester of college. But he struck me as whip smart and very eager to learn and to teach, somewhat like Chaucer's scholar. Gladly did he learn and gladly teach. He wanted to teach his country about its own history and its principles, and he turned out to be quite good at that, very talented at it. That turned out to be, in fact, his life work, cruelly shortened by an assassin's bullet. I teach at Claremont McKenna in Southern California, and last week I asked the 20 students in my section of Introduction to American Politics if they had heard of Charlie Kirk before his assassination. To my surprise, every one of them raised his or her hand. Now, a few of my students are conservatives, but most would place themselves somewhere in the great confused middle of the American political spectrum. A handful, however, were unashamed liberals. One of the latter said he regretted Kirk's murder, but still regarded him as a purveyor of hate. Most of the class, however, praised Kirk for his patriotism and civility in debates on and off campus. They all knew him from his podcasts and his internet presence broadly defined. Most seem to regard him almost as a familiar presence in their lives, almost a friend. And that was very eye-opening for me. I fully expected a few people, probably on the right, to have heard of him or to be following him, but that everyone of every political persuasion in this group of 20 would be familiar with him and would have been moved by his assassination, I would certainly not have predicted. Speaking to conservative students later out of class, there were several who were weeping as they described the effect of all of them had seen the raw footage of his assassination because they're on their phones all the time. And so they are exposed to every horrific bit of video that the phone can now bring to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Victor Davis Hanson hails Charlie Kirk not just as a master political organizer who helped Donald Trump to reach the presidency again in 2024, and who built TPUSA into the $100 million operation, which Victor rightly calls it. Victor goes beyond that. He understands that Charlie was and wanted to be much more than that. Not just a patriot, not even just a Christian, but a kind of liberator of young American minds from the ideological nescience of today's campuses. Victor himself sets a noble example of the virtues and the achievements to which Charlie, I'm sure, aspired, but was cut short from achieving. Charlie Kirk wrote or produced several books in his short life. None of them, I predict, will last. He was not given the time or the opportunity to write the kind of enduring book, say, that Bill Buckley did in his youth, having just graduated from Yale University, and he wrote God and Man at Yale, a book which still pays royalties to his son, Chris Buckley. Many, many years later, it came out in 1951. Bill had been class of 50. That achievement was denied Charlie Kirk. 31 is very young. Buckley was about that age, actually, when he wrote God and Man at Yale. But the effect of Charlie Kirk on campuses certainly was wider and may have been deeper than the effect that God and Man at Yale had and that Bill was able to have at the beginning of his career. In any case, I think that's probably enough comments for now. I'll be back, as you know, after Richard gets an opportunity to speak. And allow me to conclude just by saluting Victor Davis Hanson and wishing him a speedy recovery, as I'm sure we all do. Thank you very much.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. And now, here are remarks from PRI's 2025 Taube Family Freedom Prize winner, Professor Richard Epstein.
For the honor, it was a great pleasure to hear Victor talk about things where, in fact, we agreed, because, interestingly enough, we disagree about many things, and some of them I'll address today, and some of them I'll simply put to one side. The question is what I'm supposed to talk about, and Sally and I had some extensive deliberation on that question. And she asked me to talk about the state of intellectual development and activities on campuses throughout the United States. This is not a happy subject to deal with, but I think that we have to face it and see what it is that we want. It turns out when I entered the profession back in 1968, there was no question that it had a dominant liberal tinge, unlike the conservatives that I was at the time. And so I began life as a contrarian. But it was never a question of being exiled for your beliefs. It was always a question of having debates as to whether or not you could sustain them. And I thought the great advantage of being a classical liberal/libertarian at the time is that you were always acting under the presumption that you were wrong, and so that you could not rest on your laurels. You didn't have people to back you up. And what you had to do is to sharpen the arguments in order to survive, and that became the path by which you could develop intellectually going forward. The times that we have today are very different, and the question is, why do they happen? And I don't think you want to start with today. I think you have to go back a little bit further. How far, I cannot say. But it's quite clear that even if the trends have been moving, I think, in the wrong direction, they accelerated in the wrong direction, starting around the time of George Floyd, about 2020, where in fact there was such an outrageous reaction on the part of universities that it turns out they fell over themselves to denounce themselves for the systematic racism and other forms of evil that they all possess. And this form of self-flagellation struck me as being widely on inappropriate. Victor talked about some of the circumstances and just to fashion it up a little bit more. It also turned out that the man had 11 counts of fentanyl in his body system and a fatal dose of 3. It turned out that he couldn't breathe long before the policeman got on top of his head. It also turned out that the reason he got on top of his head was to go on the back of the head to keep the trachea open, and that somehow or other all of this got completely transmuted. And what happened in the university is everybody said, well, we know about the Calvin principles, which say that we do not act as a participant in debates that do not have a direct concern on the universities. And everyone was so eager to get rid of those things that what they did is they spent their time in self-denunciation for the racism that they now claim that they had. This is a very dangerous trend because you now deny yourself as being in some kind of an illness. What happens is you have to take curative steps. And the 2 universities I think that are most conspicuous in this, thank God, do not include NYU, although we've had our moments, but they were Harvard and Columbia. And the kind of situations that took place at both institutions showed this way in which faculty governance could lead itself into a very bad trend. And so what happens is, at the beginning, the conservative faculty members would go along with liberal appointments and hope there'd be some reciprocity. But as the liberal performances became more and further to the left, it turns out that the intellectual climate became very, very bad. And so you start looking at a place like Harvard, and all of a sudden that you decide, for example, that it is now a violation of the Civil Rights Act to deny people the control over pronouns. And I do want to mention this for the following reason, because it's something which has, thank God, disappeared in the last year or so. Pronouns are part of the common speech. And if somebody says that you have common speech, to let any individual sort of organize the speech in a contrary fashion simply disagrees with the essential pattern of how language is done, decentralized, and it turns out that pronouns are used for pronouns because it's the easiest way in which to communicate. And when you insist that people control their own pronouns, it means that nobody else can speak at all. And this became so strong at places that people were threatened with expulsion from institutions if they did not follow those commands and all the rest of it. And this to me was a very strong symbol of how it was that you were trying to use centralized control by way of fiat, backed by sanctions, in order to reshape the way in which languages work. And the Hayekian insight about language was always very strong. Its decentralized organization meant that people from all walks of life in all sorts of ways could enrich the language, and there was an implicit kind of competition such that those expressions that didn't work disappeared, those that did work continued to give. When I teach my Roman law class on this, we go through the very major transformation as words like thing start with concreteness and then become more abstract, like affair or other such of stuff, and you see how language grows and evolves, and it turns out to be tremendously sophisticated. You don't want to mess with that, and when these changes took place, that's exactly what happened. And so by the time we came to the breakdown of Columbia and Yale, the higher education was generally in crisis. But it was important to understand what the crisis was. If you looked at most of these institutions, and on a day-to-day basis, what's went on in laboratories and classrooms and so forth, much of this stuff did not have as much influence as you might have thought. And what happened is the dramatic things took over, and the stuff that were pedestrian, normal, and healthy were neglected, but they didn't necessarily die. So the question is then, what do you have to do in order to correct the stuff? And that becomes the great challenge. And here there are 2 ways in which you try to approach this. One is through the universities, and one is through the government. And trying to do this through the universities is an extremely difficult thing in order to do, because faculties have genuine power in governance, and if they're strongly in control of the left, it turns out trying to get a reform that moves people back into the other direction is going to meet with a kind of massive resistance on the part of the established faculties. And there's no question, for example, that at Columbia, the faculty senate was one of the things that led to the demise of the organization when the then president, Ms. Schaffner, tried to call the police in order to prevent people from wrecking Hamilton Hall. And at Harvard, it turned out Ms. Gay was somewhat of an autocrat, and she was backed by everybody else until the whole thing came tumbling down. Right now, there are people who are alums trying to withhold money, persuade people to do stuff. It's extremely difficult to change an organization like that. And the strategies that seem to work are those which take place, for example, at the University of Austin in Texas, or at the Civitas Institute, where what you do is you create a new body inside an old body, where essentially the balance of power is different from what it had previously been, and then hope that you can start to grow that. This is slow and this is laborious, and it turns out that as far as I'm concerned, it's not going to be immediately successful. It may not be successful at all. The only thing that's going to make it more successful is the kind of thing that Charlie Kirk tried to do, change the climate of opinion such that the median voter, as it were, inside universities is somebody who becomes a little bit more self-conscious, a little bit more cautious, a little bit less outraged. And I do think that wokeism on campus is not as high or as bad as it was a couple of years ago. And so I think there's some movement in that direction. The question then is, what can the government do in order to deal with this? And I'm afraid this is an area where we've done very badly, and that much of the problem is associated with the Trump administration. Now, how is it that I think the government ought to work? Well, the first thing is I don't think you could be namby-pamby about this and say, oh, boys will be boys, girls will be boys. Nobody should worry about the violations of the Civil Rights Act, the anti-Semitism, and all the other horrible things that took place on campus. It seems to me that it is clear that you do need to have some kind of legal response, and it has to be forcible, and it has to be directed to those people and institutions that were guilty of the wrong. The question though is, how do you execute that? And here let me just mention a couple of points that I think are very much in need. First of all, I don't think it's correct that when you start to do this stuff, what you do is you direct the target at the universities, because in fact many of the people who were victimized by the anti-Semitism and other forms of extremism were actually students at the university, and if what you try to do is to destroy the institution, what you're doing is you're killing the very people whom you're trying to help. And so the overbreath is something that you have to be deeply aware of. So then what must you do? It seems to me that if you do believe that there are individuals who engage in activities that were illegal, what you do is you institute not criminal prosecutions, not withholding general funds from the university, but try to impose sanctions on those individuals who in fact have done the wrong. And one of the characteristic features of the Trump administration is there's never the singling out or identification of an individual. There are always much more powerful, blunderbuss kinds of arrangements that to work. And so let me just give one illustration of what happens and why it is that I think it's so dangerous, and it has to do with technical issues associated with the structure of the Constitution and the executive branch. I hope it won't bore you, because on this particular kinds of issues, the success and survivability of the United States actually depends. So some months ago, we had a bipartisan coalition led by liberals, signed by conservatives like myself and Michael McConnell, said if Donald Trump wants to cancel a grant that is given to somebody in the university because there's an misappropriation of funds or improper behavior, the Congress had set out very detailed procedures which ought to be followed before those grants could be revoked. And these included due process protection associated with getting notice and an opportunity to be heard. There had to be a report that was filed. There had to be all sorts of independent investigation before you can do anything. And if you shortcut that, then everything you have is illicit. And so the traditional understanding was that the president had to take care that the law be, stressed, faithfully executed, which meant that when he was in charge of the executive branch, he had to faithfully follow the scheme that the Congress had put forward in order to determine whether or not these grants could be terminated. The president, however, had a very different view of what went on, which is that the executive branch cannot be told by anybody in Congress about the way in which the process of revocation can take place. That all of these restrictions were essentially a limitation on the unified power of the executive branch of government, and hence were illegal. And what he could do was adopt whatever procedures he wanted for whatever reason in order to deal with these kinds of questions. What this does, of course, is to completely change the balance of power, and it does in two directions. One is that it basically makes Congress somebody who is simply a bystander to what goes on in the system because it can't check or correct anything that it believes to be in excess of the president. The second thing that it does is it savages all due process guarantees that are normally given to individuals. So that if you can in fact be sacked at will under any and all circumstances, you don't get a right to a hearing, you don't have a chance to be heard, there's going to be no impartial person on top of it, and generally speaking, you never want to read a grant of power which invites those kinds of illegalities. And yet that's the pattern which seems to be taking place inside the executive branch. Want to keep foreign students out? You don't have to show cause. We just simply announce that we're not going to let them in. The system of checks and balances essentially means both halves work. I have the power to chancellor you, and you have the power to challenge me. And then there's separation of powers. I can do some things that you can't limit. And there's always a great constitutional puzzle as to which areas you can act unilaterally in and which areas you have to be governed. How do you solve this abstractly? By looking at the text is very difficult. But the key thing to understand about the way this country has always worked is it believes in incremental modifications of traditional situations is the only way that change should come about, that radical discontinuities about the way in which things are done are extraordinarily dangerous. And I think we're fighting with that particular situation when we start walking about the system as it exists today. And so I don't want to apologize for anything that has been wrong, or have done in the universities, but I do believe that one kind of reaction cannot justify another kind of reaction if the first move is inappropriate and the response is inappropriate as well. So what's the really hard challenge about this situation? It's how you manage to use the bulky provisions that we exist to achieve the particular ends that have to be obtained. And I think what will happen is that you will discover that it's a lot harder to do than you might have otherwise thought, because a blunderbuss attack makes everybody into a villain, but the particularized proceedings that I'm talking about here give them a chance to speak and to defend themselves. We will see how this thing plays out in a different realm, but the same problem. Can you, as a president, remove somebody, quote unquote, for cause or without cause, if they are a member of the Federal Reserve Board? Miss Lisa Cook is the illustration. And the position that is often taken by Trump is, I have cause, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. And so if you use the standard techniques in order to make for cause removals, you have to have a procedure which explains why you're doing this and how you're doing it, and a substantive report which indicates the statutes or the rules that have been violated and why this is the appropriate remedy. None of that was done. So then the next argument is that we don't have to do any of that because we're back to the at-will world in which the President of the United States can fire anybody from the Federal Reserve Board and so forth. And this is, I think, one of the great contrasts that you have. Governments are fiduciaries. Fiduciaries do not have the same freedom of action that private parties do with respect to their own situation. So 40 years ago when I wrote about contracts, I wrote a paper called In Defense of the Contract at Will, 1 second, in which I said hiring and firing at will in competitive markets is the only way that markets can work. But when you're dealing with government and fiduciaries, a for-cause regime has to be put into place. And the great danger that we have in the current administration is that piece of wisdom is perhaps being ignored.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.